What does it take for a person to vanish, not into thin air, but into the silence of history? And when someone disappears or meets a tragic fate, how often is the truth obscured not by mystery, but by the hands of those in power determined to bury it? These are questions that echo through countless haunting cases, and few are as chilling as the grim fate of Bridget Hurford. Bridget's story begins in a world where power and influence shape destiny far more than justice or truth. Hers was not simply a tale of violence, but of betrayal, deception, and the unsettling reality of what happens when those who should protect instead seek to silence. To this day, her name is whispered in the shadows of historical true crime, a reminder of how fragile a single life can be when weighed against the ambitions of others. In this chilling mystery, Bridget Hurford was no anonymous figure swept aside by circumstance. She was a woman with her own struggles, her own story, and her own quiet resilience. Yet, the story we are told, that she was condemned for a crime and punished with finality, leaves us with more questions than answers. Was she truly guilty of the act she was accused of? Or was she another victim of a system more interested in control than in truth? The haunting case of Bridget Hurford carries with it all the elements of a Gothic tragedy: betrayal, deceit, a courtroom that doubled as a stage for social drama, and a sentence that continues to unsettle anyone who revisits the details. But beyond the chilling facts lies a deeper reflection. How do we measure justice in a world where reputation often outweighed reality? And how do we honor those who were silenced long before their side of the story could be truly heard? As we trace Bridget's story, from the life she once lived, to the events that unraveled it, and the shocking consequences that followed, we step into a tale that is not only about one woman, but about a society willing to turn tragedy into spectacle. It's a story that asks us to look closer, to question what really happened, and to reflect on how easily the truth can be manipulated when the balance of power is uneven. So, what really happened to Bridget Hurford? Was her fate the result of her own actions, or was it written for her by those who held all the power? As we explore the details of this case, we may not uncover every answer, but perhaps we will uncover something more lasting, a reminder of how chillingly fragile justice can be when truth is lost to time. To understand the chilling fate of Bridget Hurford, we must first step back into her life, long before it became entangled with betrayal and tragedy. She was not born into notoriety. She was born into a world that, at first glance, seemed unremarkable. A modest upbringing in a community where survival was often more pressing than dreams. Bridget grew up in a household that valued resilience. Her parents, though not wealthy, instilled in her a quiet strength. Neighbors remembered her as the girl who always lent a hand, someone willing to share even the little she had. She wasn't the kind of figure one might expect to later be thrust into the spotlight of a sensational case. She was, in many ways, ordinary, and that's what makes her story so unsettling. By her early adulthood, Bridget was described as striking, not only in appearance but in presence. She carried herself with a kind of grace, one acquaintance reportedly recalled, yet she was not without her struggles. Like many women of her era, her opportunities were limited by circumstance. Work was often grueling, wages meager, and reputation everything. The smallest misstep could brand a woman in ways she might never recover from. Friends remembered her as warm and quick-witted, someone who could brighten a room, even when her own burdens weighed heavily on her. She had an instinct for kindness, but she was no stranger to hardship. Her relationships were often complicated, shaped by the expectations of her society and the pressures of survival. Behind her smile, there was a quiet resilience, but also a vulnerability that made her susceptible to betrayal. Bridget's life before her downfall paints a picture of a woman navigating the precarious balance between independence and dependency. Some accounts suggest she was drawn to people of influence, not out of ambition, but perhaps necessity. She wanted stability, maybe even protection, one contemporary account noted. Yet, aligning herself with powerful figures would ultimately set the stage for her undoing. What is striking about Bridget's life is the sharp contrast between the ordinariness of her beginnings and the extraordinary tragedy of her end. She was not a figure destined for scandal. She was someone who laughed with friends, who endured the quiet struggles of daily life, who dreamed of a future that now feels forever unfinished. But beneath this image of simplicity was a reality few could have predicted, the very qualities that made Bridget beloved: her openness, her willingness to trust, her longing for stability, also made her vulnerable to manipulation. And in a society where a woman's voice was often drowned out by the authority of men, vulnerability could be fatal. Reflecting on Bridget's life, one can't help but wonder, if she had lived in a different time, would her fate have been different? Could she have carved out a life of safety, love, and respect without the looming shadow of scandal and betrayal? Or was she always destined to become a cautionary tale in a world where power too often decided truth? Her story reminds us that the victims of haunting cases are not just names etched into the pages of history. They were people with laughter, with friendships, with private hopes. Bridget Hurford was not simply a case. She was a woman with a life, one that was stolen far too soon. And it is that humanity, that fragile ordinariness, that makes the chilling nature of her fate all the more haunting. It started like any other workday, unremarkable, almost dull. Bridget rose before the light, stoked a small stove, and set water to boil. By habit, she checked the latch on the door twice, then opened the shutters to a sky the color of pewter. There was talk of rain. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into a street that still belonged to sparrows and milkmen. Nothing about those first small movements suggested that her name would soon be stitched to a chilling mystery people would argue about for years. The first turn in the day came with a letter. It arrived folded tight, the seal pressed deep. The handwriting was careful, too careful. Bridget recognized it instantly. She didn't open it in the doorway. She slid it into her pocket and carried it to the table like something that might break. When she did unfold the page, her hands paused at the first line. There was no greeting, only instructions. A time, a place, and the old warning that the fewer people who knew, the better. It was signed only with an initial she knew all too well, someone whose influence reached into rooms she would never be invited to enter. By mid-morning, routine faltered. She skipped a stop she never skipped, offered rushed apologies to a woman who depended on her help, and turned her steps toward the edge of town where the hedgerows narrowed and the lane ran down to the river. Twice she looked back. Twice she kept walking. This was not a choice she wanted, but one she believed she had to make. The letter had hinted at closure, at settling accounts. It promised, in the language of people who believed there. Words were law, that everything could be put behind them if she did as instructed. At the mill bridge, she waited. The river moved in its low, patient way, the sound of water, stitching together all the years that had brought her here. She had half a mind to turn around, half a mind to throw the letter into the current and let the water take it away. Then he arrived, the estate agent, the man who spoke for those with power. He approached without hurry, a hat pulled low against the drizzle that had begun to fall. He did not greet her. He glanced to be sure they were alone, then asked if she had brought everything. She handed him a cloth bundle, letters, receipts, and one small ribbon token that never should have left its owner's drawer. He didn't thank her. He flipped through the pages quickly, as if skimming would somehow erase what they contained. "There," he said, "that's all of it." His voice made all sound like a warning. He offered nothing in return, no receipt, no assurance, not even the agreed coin. When she asked about it, he smiled the way men smile when they believe they cannot be held to account. You'll be looked after, he said, provided you keep quiet. What happened next lives in competing stories. Bridget said later that she demanded what was promised, that she told him she would not be made small and silent. A farmhand on the far bank claimed he saw raised hands, not fists gestures sharp enough to cut, but words lost in the wind. Another witness swore an argument became a scuffle, that one of them slipped on wet boards, that the bundle burst open and papers skidded like pailfish along the planks. In one telling, the agent shoved first. In another, Bridget did. Truth peeled away from certainty. The moment those pages scattered dot by noon, the sky had opened. The river darkened and swelled. Bridget left the bridge with no papers and no coin, only the brittle taste of insult. She walked fast, head down, water seeping into her shoes, a kind of cold that makes you feel newly alone in a town you thought you knew. Near the old smithy, she encountered a friend who would later say Bridget looked set on something, jaw tight, eyes bright with the strain of a morning spent bargaining with someone who dealt only in leverage dot in the early afternoon. Another letter found her. This one slipped by a runner into the hands of a shopkeep who knew better than to ask questions. The message was shorter, the tone harder. A summons to the back entrance of the great house at dusk. Come alone. No more mistakes. She read it twice and tucked it away. Could anyone have predicted what was about to happen? That a day shaped by. Small deferrals and quiet humiliations would tilt, finally, into something irreversible. The rain slackened by evening. She skirted the main road and took the path behind the hedges to the service gate, where barrels were rolled in and secrets rolled out. She waited under the eaves, counting breaths. When the door opened, it wasn't the agent who stepped into the dim courtyard, but someone above him, gloved, composed, comfortable with the balance of fear in the room. Words were exchanged, low and quick. The shape of the bargain changed. Bridget was told there would be nothing more, no coin, no promise, only an expectation of silence. And then came the threat. If the letters were not returned in full, if even a single page surfaced, her name would be dragged into court and left there to drown dot accounts diverge again in the crucial minutes that followed. The cook's boy said voices rose. The groom swore he heard a crash. A neighbor saw a figure run, then another follow. When the agent finally appeared, he had blood along one cuff and the calm of a man who believed the story would be told his way. Bridget was found not far from the gate, in the shadow of the garden wall, on her knees and trembling, rainwater slicking dark into her hair and sleeves. A broken lantern lay near her feet, glass glittering like a scatter of unasked questions. By nightfall the constable had been called, and the narrative had already begun to harden. The agent spoke first. He spoke confidently. He spoke as if the words had been chosen hours ago. Bridget tried to answer, but every sentence she offered seemed to arrive a moment too late, always one step behind a story written by people who had never needed to prove they were telling the truth. That is how the day ended, with a promise turned. To threat, a confrontation filtered through the mouths of men who had more friends than facts, and a woman walking into night, carrying the weight of a decision she never truly had the power to make. In the official record, this is the day the case became a haunting case, a chilling mystery, the point at which the line between power and deceit grew so thin that, even now, we have to hold it up to the light to see where it was meant to run. The first whispers began not with an alarm, but with absence. Bridget, who was almost always seen the morning after market day, did not appear at the baker's, nor was she spotted walking the lane to the apothecary. By mid-morning, the Gap Inn. Routine became a knot of unease. People who knew her habits grew concerned. One neighbor remarked later, she was a woman of pattern. You could set your watch by her steps. When she did not come, when her doorway stayed shut, and her shutters remained closed, it was as though a note had gone missing from a familiar song. Something felt out of place, that the discovery itself came at dusk, nearly 24 hours after she was last seen near the service gate of the estate. A farmhand cutting through the back fields noticed a shawl tangled in the brambles against the garden wall. It was unmistakably hers, the same knitted one she had mended more than once, the one she never walked without. Following the trail, the man found scuffed earth, broken branches, and then just beyond the low ditch, the still figure of Bridget Hurford. She was collapsed to one side, her hair clinging wet to her cheek, her hands drawn up as if to ward off something that had already passed. The lantern glass lay in pieces near her feet. The farmhand ran shouting back into town, and before long, a crowd gathered along the wall, lanterns flickering like watchful eyes. The constable arrived, stiff with authority, but visibly shaken. For this was not just another accident on the riverbank, not a fall from a cart. Bridget's position, the bruising along her arms, the torn fabric at her sleeve, these spoke of something darker. The town that once felt safe was now cloaked in fear, as though every shadow might hide an intent no one had cared to imagine until now. The constable called for assistance from the nearby district. By midnight, officials from the county had arrived. They carried with them an air of detachment, as though Bridget were merely another entry in their ledger. Still, they ordered the body to be moved under tarp and placed her shawl and belongings into rough canvas sacks. The estate gate was examined, but hastily. Questions were asked of the servants, yet their answers seemed rehearsed. We heard nothing unusual. We saw no one by the wall. The narrative was already narrowing. In the small hours of the morning, Bridget's body was taken to the town hall. Neighbors waited in silence along the roadside, hats held low, shawls pulled tight against the damp. Few spoke. Fewer still dared to question the way the officials exchanged glances, how the agent himself appeared untouched by suspicion, standing a little too near the constable, as though to remind him of debts owed. News spread quickly. By dawn, the whole town was awake with it. Markets buzzed, not with trade, but with rumor. Some said Bridget had been silenced for knowing too much. Others believed she had been tricked into a trap she couldn't escape. One elderly woman whispered that Bridget's defiance had cost her, that she had refused to bow, and that those in power never forgave such things. The inquest was convened the following day. It was rushed, almost perfunctory. Testimonies contradicted one another. A groom claimed to have seen her stumble. A cook's boy swore she had raised her voice at the estate door. The agent, calm and practiced, declared that Bridget had left in a state of agitation, and that her fall must have been the result of her own distress. Each time the constable pressed for clarity, the agent reminded him of Bridget's difficult temperament, painting her as reckless, even unstable. The more he spoke, the less space there was for her own story. When the coroner read the findings, that Bridget had died by misadventure, a tragic accident brought on by her own choices, the room erupted in murmurs. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked down, unwilling to meet one another's eyes. The decision felt less like justice and more like closure forced upon them by men who needed the matter finished in the days that followed. Bridget was buried quietly, without the ceremony she might have deserved. The churchyard filled, but the silence there was heavy, more with frustration than grief. "It isn't right," one woman muttered, as the soil covered the coffin. "It isn't right, and they know it." The aftermath lingered longer than officials might have wished. Children were kept closer to home. Doors were barred earlier. Women walked in pairs where they once had walked alone. Conversations shifted quickly if a stranger drew near. Trust, once a given in a small town, had curdled into suspicion. For all the official insistence that Bridget's death was a mere accident, the undercurrent in the town suggested otherwise. People were not satisfied with the coroner's swift conclusion, nor with the district official's eagerness to close the file. And so, even as the ink on the inquest report dried, the true investigation fragmented, whispered, driven by rumor and fragments of memory, was only just beginning. At the heart of this unease stood one pressing question. If Bridget had not simply fallen, then who had ensured she would not rise again? Naturally, suspicion first fell upon the estate's agent, the very man with whom Bridget had quarreled so publicly in the weeks before her death. Accounts varied, but several townsfolk recalled hearing raised voices near the estate offices not long before she disappeared. Bridget, they said, had been arguing over a rent increase that many believed was designed less for financial gain than as punishment. The agent, of course, presented himself as a victim of her stubbornness. He told the coroner that Bridget had left distressed and unsteady, implying that her agitation had led to her fatal stumble. But the timing and his authority over the constable raised uncomfortable questions. Was it mere coincidence that the one person with the most to gain from silencing Bridget was also the one whose testimony shaped the entire inquest? Still, there was no tangible evidence tying him to the scene. No witness had seen him near the wall that night. His reputation for manipulation was known, but manipulation is not, in itself, a crime. And so, while suspicion clung to him, it did so like smoke visible, thick, but impossible to hold. Another theory emerged from the quieter corners of the estate. One maid, speaking in hushed tones to her sister, suggested that Bridget may have been lured toward the service gate, not by the agent, but by one of the household staff. Bridget, after all, was well liked, even trusted by some within the house. It was whispered that a groom had been seen speaking to her privately, and that he may have owed his position to her discretion in some undisclosed matter. Could it be that a personal dispute had flared into violence? Or perhaps the servant had acted at someone else's bidding, a proxy used to ensure that no suspicion would fall upon those higher up. These were tantalizing ideas, but again they rested on whispers. No servant ever came forward. The household, bound by loyalty or fear, closed ranks quickly. If anyone knew more, they took their knowledge to the grave. There were also those who believed Bridget had been attacked by someone entirely outside the estate's orbit. The broken lantern glass, some argued, suggested that she had been startled. In the dark, ambushed rather than coaxed. There had been a drifter seen on the main road that week, a man with no fixed address, carrying a pack and walking with a limp. Some claimed he lingered near the fields at dusk. It was easy, in a community suddenly gripped by fear, to project guilt onto the stranger. His very difference made him suspect. But no one could place him near the gate on the night in question. No theft was evident. Nothing had been taken from Bridget's person. And if a wandering attacker had been responsible, why had the official narrative not seized upon that explanation, which would have spared the estate any scrutiny? Perhaps, then, the drifter was little more than a convenient distraction, a way for townsfolk to channel unease without confronting the power imbalance that governed their lives. And yet, amid all these suspicions, there were those who clung to the simplest explanation, that Bridget had indeed fallen, perhaps while hurrying, perhaps after a confrontation that left her shaken. They pointed to her pride, her insistence on confronting authority directly. They argued that grief had clouded judgment, that the townspeople's anger at the estate had twisted a tragic misstep into a murder in their imaginations. But this theory, though practical, left much unexplained. The bruising on her arms, the torn sleeve, the scattered fragments of glass, these details resisted neat classification. Was it truly possible that a stumble alone accounted for all of it? Or was this the tidy version of the story that the powerful most wished people to believe? What is most striking, looking back, is not how many suspects were seriously considered, but how few. The constable, caught between duty and deference, did not press the agent on the inconsistencies in his statements. The servant's rumors were never officially recorded. The drifter, if he existed at all, was never traced. Instead, the case was sealed before it had truly begun. This failure left room for speculation to thrive. Over the years, the story of Bridget's death became less about facts and more about interpretations. Some saw it as a parable of corruption, others as a cautionary tale of defiance. The lack of resolution gave each version equal weight, and none could be disproven. But the question still lingered: did the evidence truly point to any of them? Or was the evidence itself so thin, so carefully shaped, that it was never meant to point anywhere at all? Perhaps that is the most haunting part of Bridget Hurford's story. Not just that a woman lost her life, but that the mechanisms of justice seemed uninterested in uncovering how or why. By failing to pursue the contradictions, by accepting the word of the powerful over the silence of the vulnerable, the officials ensured that the truth slipped beyond reach. And so we are left with fragments, rumors of servants, shadows of strangers, and the heavy silence of an estate that knew far more than it ever revealed. In that silence, suspicion thrives, and in that suspicion, the image of Bridget herself remains, not as a woman defined by her choices, but as a mystery defined by its absence of answers. And beneath it all, the estate loomed larger than ever, not merely a house on the hill, but a reminder that power could bend truth into whatever shape it required. For those who knew Bridget, her fate was more than a personal tragedy. It was a mirror held to their society. It revealed starkly that justice was not always blind, that sometimes it kept its eyes wide open, fixed on the hand that held the most influence. Perhaps what shocked people most wasn't just the crime itself, but what it revealed about the world they lived in. That one woman's voice could be so swiftly smothered. That truth could be so easily rewritten. And that, in the end, fear could spread faster than fact, leaving behind a community forever changed. If there was one aspect of Bridget Hurford's story that revealed more about society than the crime itself, it was the way it was reported, debated, and quietly shaped in the public eye. For while the official investigation was brisk and inconclusive, the trial of opinion conducted in the taverns, market stalls, and eventually in the newspapers lingered far longer. It is important to begin with what did not happen. There was no trial in the conventional sense. No one was ever charged in connection with Bridget's death, and the coroner's report, leaning heavily on the estate agent's testimony, concluded that she had met her end through misadventure. That decision, however, did not still the whispers. In fact, it only inflamed them. The townspeople had expected more. They wanted to see the agent called to account, if only to answer questions under oath. They wanted the bruising, the torn fabric, and the broken lantern glass scrutinized in detail. But instead, the system closed ranks. And in doing so, it created a void, one that the public, and later the media, rushed to fill. Local papers picked up the story first, their coverage reflecting the unease of the community. Bridget was painted as both victim and symbol, a hard-working woman who had dared to speak against authority, only to pay with her life. These accounts lingered on the details of her final hours, describing the crumbled earth near the wall, the silence of the servants, and the strangely swift burial. But not all coverage was sympathetic. Larger regional newspapers, those with closer ties to political and landowning interests, took a markedly different tone. They described Bridget as obstinate, reckless, and even unstable, framing her death as the predictable outcome of her own defiance. To them, she was less a victim than a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen to those who challenged the natural order. This divergence in reporting created two parallel narratives, one of injustice, rooted in the voices of the poor, and one of inevitability favored by the powerful. And in the absence of a formal trial, the battle over Bridget's legacy was waged not in a courtroom, but in the press, not among the townsfolk. However, the issue was never so abstract. For them, Bridget's death was not a story to be consumed, but a reality that shaped their daily lives. Parents cautioned their children against speaking too freely. Workers exchanged wary glances when discussing the estate. The notion that someone could die under suspicious circumstances and yet see no justice sent a clear message. The rules were not written for everyone equally, and perhaps that was what shocked people most. Not just that Bridget had died, but that her death revealed, with brutal clarity, how little protection ordinary people could expect when their paths crossed with power. It is in this reaction that the true weight of Bridget's case emerges. On one hand, it exposed the vulnerabilities of women in a society where their voices carried little legal weight. Bridget had stood up for her self-demanded fairness, dignity, and recognition. But when she died, her character was questioned, her words reframed, and her body reduced to evidence that officials chose not to examine too closely. On the other hand, the case illuminated the broader imbalance between landowners and tenants, masters and servants, authority and the governed. To some, Bridget's death was not just a tragedy, but a warning. It demonstrated how quickly justice could be bent, or even denied, when those in power had an interest in silencing uncomfortable truths. Over time, the story of Bridget Hurford faded from the headlines, replaced by fresher scandals and tragedies. But it never fully disappeared. In the town itself, her name became shorthand for injustice. Her story was retold in whispers by workers at the estate, by mothers teaching their daughters caution, by those who believed that silence was sometimes the only shield. And outside the town, occasional articles resurfaced in the years that followed, often reframing Bridget's story to suit a particular agenda, sometimes as a tale of female recklessness, sometimes as evidence of the need for reform in the justice system. Each retelling bent her life and her death into something symbolic. But what was lost in all these versions? Was Bridget herself, the woman behind the symbol, whose final hours remain obscured by rumor, speculation, and silence? For all the suspicion, all the whispers, and all the unanswered questions surrounding Bridget Hurford's death, there remains one truth that is perhaps the hardest to accept. Nothing was ever resolved. No one was ever formally accused. No trial was held. And so, with time, the case slipped into the long shadows of history. Yet even in those shadows, questions continue to stir. The most persistent of these questions is also the simplest. How did Bridget really die? The official account that she slipped while carrying a lantern and fell against the stones was presented as fact, but many who knew her never accepted it. Bridget was cautious by nature, particularly at night, and those who worked alongside her found it difficult to believe she would have ventured into the dark, alone without good reason. Then there were the marks on her body, bruising, tearing of her clothes, and the broken lantern glass all suggested something more violent. Could it really have been an accident? Or were these signs of a struggle? And if there had been a struggle, with whom? Over the years, several theories emerged. Some pointed the finger directly at the estate agent. He had both motive and opportunity, and his swift testimony seemed to many like the actions of a man eager to close the matter quickly. Did he lure Bridget outside under some pretense? Did a confrontation escalate beyond what he intended? These questions have haunted the story since the beginning. Others wondered if Bridget's death was not premeditated, but opportunistic. Perhaps she had caught someone in the act stealing from the estate, or engaged in something illicit and paid the price for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This theory, though harder to prove, fits with the sense of secrecy that seemed to descend on the household after her death. And then there is the darker, more unsettling possibility that Bridget's death was not just about her, but about the message it sent, a warning to others not to question authority, not to resist, not to step beyond their station. In this reading, her death was less an accident, or even a crime of passion, and more an act of calculated silencing. What complicates the matter further is the silence of those who might have known more. The servants who lived and worked under the watchful eye of the estate never spoke openly. Some claimed ignorance, others refused to be drawn into speculation. Perhaps they truly knew nothing, or perhaps they knew too much and understood the dangers of speaking out. This silence is one of the most haunting aspects of the case. In a small community, secrets rarely stay buried for long. And yet, in Bridget's case, the silence endured, as though fear itself had stitched lips closed as decades passed. The evidence, if there ever was any, faded away. Witnesses died, memories blurred, and records vanished. What remained were fragments, newspaper clippings, whispers in local lore, and the sharp outline of a young woman whose life ended too soon. Each generation retold the story, reshaping it to fit their own understanding of injustice, but never finding the missing piece that might bring clarity. Theories continue to circulate even now, with amateur historians and true crime enthusiasts debating the possibilities. Some argue that the case was mishandled from the beginning, deliberately obscured to protect the reputation of the estate. Others believe it was simply an accident that took on a life of its own, transformed by grief, gossip, and distrust into something more sinister. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps Bridget did stumble, but the circumstances that led her there, the fear, the conflict, the imbalance of power made her death feel less like misfortune and more like inevitability. In that sense, the mystery is not only about how she died, but about the forces that shaped her life and silenced her voice. And that is why Bridget Hurford's case endures. Not because it can ever be solved with certainty, but because it represents something larger: the fragility of justice, the vulnerability of those who dare to stand up, and the unsettling ease with which stories can be rewritten when powerful. Interests are at stake, and so, decades later, the truth remains just out of reach. And that is the story of Bridget Hurford, a woman whose name has nearly slipped into obscurity, yet whose fate continues to echo with unanswered questions. Her life, though brief, leaves us with a reminder of how fragile truth can be when overshadowed by silence, power, and time. What do you think? Was Bridget's death a tragic accident, or was it something far more sinister? Have you heard of this case before, or is this your first time learning about it? I'd love to hear your thoughts, theories, and reflections in the comments below. If you found this investigation meaningful, consider subscribing for more quiet, haunting explorations into forgotten crimes and mysteries. This channel is dedicated to telling the stories of those who can no longer speak for themselves, and your support helps ensure that their voices, however faint, are not lost to time. Thank you for watching and for taking the time to reflect on Bridget's story. Until next time, stay safe and take care.